certainly have fears that there is a serial killer at loose in Perth.
Sarah Spears, Jane Rimmer, Ciara Glennon.
And every time you saw a young girl walking by, you think, oh God, is she going to be the next victim?
Now, one man stands accused.
If police are right and Edwards is the Claremont serial killer, he's been hiding in plain sight for 20 years.
Today, court heard how a world-first fibre database was created in the search for the Claremont serial killer. Welcome to week 18 of Claremont in Conversation. Good to have your company. Natalie Bonjolo, Tim Clark and Alison Fan with you today. Tim, this was really interesting, how they built this database specifically for the macro investigation.
Yeah, that's right, Nat. We've referenced this fibre database a couple of times in previous podcasts, but today we really found out about it and found about one of the men behind it, who was Rhys Powell, who was one of the fibre analysts at the Chem Centre and who is the man who is giving evidence today and we think will be giving evidence for the rest of the week. And the way he described it was the work that was done by the Chem Centre on the macro investigation, particularly around fibres, was just massive. It was intensive, and it threw up so many fibres, thousands and thousands of fibres, that the Chem Centre really had to come up with a new way of cataloguing them and particularly being able to compare them one to another. And hopefully from their point of view, when they did possibly get a source of the fibres, then be able to put that into the database and compare it as well. What they used to do was just put it on a spreadsheet, an Excel spreadsheet, an old style Excel spreadsheet. But that was just completely impractical for the amount of fibres that they had and had to compare to one another. And so they reinvented the wheel basically and came up with their own system, which is now world renowned, world leading. And as we found out right at the end of the day, has actually had papers being written on it and is being held up as an exemplar of the way that possibly fibre evidence is correlated and compared in the future.
Wow, so this really gained worldwide accolades.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was Mr. Powell who was actually a co-author of this scientific study that was done on his own database that was then published in a international forensic journal, which was, the paper itself was actually highly commended, peer reviewed, and was then referenced in the fibre investigations book, written by one of the other witnesses in the case, James Robertson. So yeah, I mean, this was really groundbreaking work on a global scale, and it really was did break new ground in terms of the macro investigation and the Claremont investigation, as we heard today.
So, Ali, how many fibres are actually on this database? Did you hear that?
Thousands and thousands. They said they were mainly for the macro task force, which was the Claremont killings, but it was also drawn into another puzzling murder case at the time, and that was the Gerard Ross one. But we're talking thousands and thousands of fibres of all types.
And so, predominantly, they were macro-related.
Well, Mr. Powell was saying that, of course, they were trying to find out where they came from. And it was, of course, while they were examining the fibres found in Jane Rimmer's hair, that they noticed that they had characteristics from fabric used in cars. And I think this prompted a question, again, from the judge, Stephen Hall, as to how they came to examine the Holden car. And it was after much research that they found that the 20 grey polyester fibres found in Jane's hair corresponded to a seat fabric from a VS Holden Commodore, which was the car driven by the accused man over those years.
Tim, how did they compile the database? You know, was it just a matter of going and re-examining the exhibits?
Yeah, so they had, as Ali's just said, thousands and thousands of fibres, 4,500 roughly, to do with macro in particular. But then they were also trying to find where these fibres came from. So they were out there getting all these so-called source fibres. And to do that, we heard today that the scientists took off their lab coats and put on their work boots and were actually out in the field, particularly in wreckers' yards and the police holding yards, looking at all these cars, trying to find this match. Because as Ali just mentioned, they looked at the particular chemical structure of these grey fibres that were found in Jane's hair, and they were similar but not exactly the same. They showed a particular characteristic that they'd seen in other fibres used in cars. And so they were working blind, he admitted that, but they were going on a hunch, a scientific hunch, but a hunch nonetheless, that these grey fibres might have come from cars. And so they went out and tried to find this needle in a haystack, and which took them years, and hundreds of samples, source samples, were then being brought back to the lab, and obviously they had to be then input into the database and then compared with the fibres they had. And so that's the way they were going about it. And as Ali said, amazingly, in about October 2013, they came up with what they thought was a match, and this match was a Holden Commodore VS Series 1 or 2, and they tested loads of other Holdens, but this was the one. This was the one that really, really looked the same, and when they put it under the microscope and did all the microspectrometry, had all the same chemical characteristics. But obviously, so they had this, and this was in a report that actually ChemCenter compiled and gave to the police in 2014, an official 200-odd page report of all their findings from all their work stretching back all those years. But in 2014, obviously, they didn't have a person of interest, because we know Mr. Williams had by this time fallen off the radar because they had the DNA match, but they didn't have a person of interest, so they didn't have a car to reference it to, as it was then. And they were also looking for all these other groups of fibres, because what they did is to categorize these fibres, they put them into groups, and it was 129 different groups of fibres they found on all the physical exhibits, which included obviously Jane and Ciara's hair, their bodies, the vegetation around their bodies, so dozens and dozens and dozens of possible fibre sources and samples. So they grouped them all together. This grey polyester group was the group that eventually they pinpointed down to the car, and then they had a blue polyester group which had been found on both Claremont victims, and subsequently was found on the victim, the Karakata rape victim. They found similar fibres there, so they grouped those all together. But again, they didn't have a source. They didn't know where this might have come from, because they didn't have a person of interest. So, as intensive and as extensive as that report was, it had to be parked by the police, because they really, at that point in 2014, didn't have anything to compare it to. But as we know now, 2 years later, they did have a comparison to look at, and so that report was revived, taken out of the drawer, and boy, did it prove to have been done some very valuable work.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite extraordinary to think about it, isn't it, really, that this was simply methodical testing of all of these thousands of fibres, that they managed to narrow it down to a specific make and model. And of course, what you're saying is this is years before Edward's arrest.
Yeah, and that's, sorry, Ali, go on.
No, I was just saying it was a bit of a mix and match too, wasn't it? Because the fibres they found on Ciara's clothing, they didn't match with anything, but then they checked the hair, and then they found 8 fibres covered from Ciara Glennon's hair that matched the seat insert. So it was all a bit of hit and miss, that they just went right through it all, and it's incredibly detailed, as you were saying.
Yeah, and the fact that even within the car, Nat, there were numerous different types of fibres. So if you think of the inside of your own car, you could probably see there's different fabric on the roof, different fabric on the floor, different fabric on the seats, maybe different fabric in the back seats to the front seats, different fabric in the boot again, and that's exactly what it proved to be, because there were all these different similar types of grey fibres, but slightly different. And as it turned out, they were all from the same car, but they were different fabrics inside the car. And so you can imagine the amount of just mind-numbingly technical and detailed work would have had to gone into getting every one of those fibres into a solution, then on a slide, then under a microscope, and then you compare them one by one.
Wow.
And it absolutely boggles the mind that the amount of work that had gone into this, just this part of the investigation. And remember that they had nothing to compare it to at the moment, so they were doing this in the hope of maybe finding something in a day to come. I mean, referencing that study, or the paper that Mr. Powell spoke of today. You know, I'm a geek, so I emailed Brendan. I emailed Brendan Chapman, our good friend, this afternoon. Said, "Would you happy to have a copy of that somewhere?" And he did, and he's emailed it to me. And I'll just read this. So there were 476 polyester fibres, blue fibres, found as part of the study, or as part of the investigation, sorry. But when you compared those to each other, just those 476, you came up with 113,050 comparisons could just be made between those two. So that's just a tiny portion of what they had, and they had 4,000 odd fibres to compare. So the maths, the science, is just boggling. It's baffling. It's taken all this time.
I think you've missed your calling. You should have been part of the forensic science team.
We've already almost enrolled him at the Murdoch University's forensic scientists.
Well, I hope you have,
course.
because even the fact that they got the fibres in the first place from a car that's like 20 years has gone through so many owners, and they said they had to find little bits of the car where that hadn't been perhaps vacuumed and cleaned over and over and over.
Mm.
So,
yeah, it's incredible. It really is incredible, impressive, and from the prosecution's case perspective, it could be invaluable.
Mm.
And Tim, did they describe how they actually went through these fibres? Because obviously, they couldn't run them through any kind of a system, as we know. So they're literally looking at these fibres one by one through a microscope, and then trying to match them to all of these various fibres that they've gone and collected from in the community. Yeah,
that's right. So they had a colour. Obviously, they had a colour to go on. They had the makeup of the fibre to go on. And so they would start there. Mr. Powell said, obviously, they had the time of the crimes to go on. So at first, they were looking at cars pre-96, cars of the era, made at the time and then made earlier. So look, they weren't just going up to every car in the street and just saying, "Can I have a bit of your seat cover?" They were a little bit more scientific than that. But I mean, you can imagine how many cars from 97, but maybe back to 94, would have had a grey polyester seat. I mean, and we got a taste of the amount of work they had to do when we actually saw a photo of one of the scientists peering into a very crumpled white car at some wreckers somewhere back in the mid-90s. So the amount of phone calls and swatches that they must have taken over the time would just boggle the mind, I suppose. But once they had that fibre, then they had to go back to the lab, extract it, do all the science stuff, and then put it under the microscope and compare it to the fibres they had. And there were various things they had to look at: the colour, obviously, the width, the makeup of the fibre itself, and then whether it had a delusterant on it, which from what we saw in court today gave it a distinctive sort of black speckled look, and the lustrant was whether you wanted your fabric to be shiny or not, and so there were all these different elements that they had to look at in each fibre, and somehow somewhere along the line they managed to chance upon these fibres from this particular model of car. And then it was the seat, as Ali said, it was the seat insert, so the middle of the seat. There was some carpet in the boot that was particular, and then there was the carpet actually in the cabin, so in the footwells of the drivers and the passenger side. And as it turned out, or as the prosecution case says, it was those grey fibres that ended up being an almost corresponding match to the fibres that were found in both Jane's hair and on Ciara.
So they've got this incredible catalogue and this database of information, and then in 2016 they seize a car. So what happens then forensically?
Yeah, well, I mean, that we talked about that previously. That was almost a miracle in itself that they found this car. It was the car that Mr. Edwards drove because they could match the VIN numbers. They took it in, and as we've heard over the last 2 weeks, they spent days and days and days going through that car, literally with a fine-tooth comb and a vacuum and a microscope and a light and everything else they could possibly think of to try and find whatever they could in the car. Obviously, they were looking for biological material. If they could find some blood or some hair or some sign that either Jane or Ciara or Ciara had been in that car, that's what they were looking for. That's what they're hoping for, but they didn't find that. But the next best thing was to find to take swatches of all the fabrics, all the different types of fabrics in that car, and then take them back to the lab and compare them to the fibres that they had. And that's what they did. And that's what we saw today was the results of those tests.
Because, Tim, what was this over? About 2-3 years? Because we originally talked about 2013. So they were really examining things right from back in 2013, sampling fabrics, right through to when they got the car 3 years later.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've spoken so often about the vast expanse of time that this investigation has taken, and I mean the fibres. Once again, we didn't really know how important and how much emphasis the police were putting on them, but certainly they knew at the Chem Centre because that was a major part of their work. It was so major, in fact, that it's led to, as I say, this database being set up, which is now the envy of the forensic world.
Yeah. What was Reece Powell able to tell us or to tell the court about the fibre comparisons against the Telstra workwear, which we just mentioned a little earlier?
Yeah, so that came later, once again, post-arrest. So now they knew they had Mr. Edwards in custody. He'd been charged with Jane and Ciara's murders, eventually Sarah's murder as well. They had his car. They knew, obviously, that this car matched the car that Chem Centre had pinpointed all those years ago. But then in 2018 and early 2019, these of the time Telstra workwear came into their possession via some long-time Telstra workers. And as we've said previously, this was what basically led to this trial being delayed for many, many months, the start of it anyway, because these pants turned up and shorts turned up and they were handed over to the Chem Centre and said, what can you do with these? Do these match? Does this match anything? And during the analysis of the car, that they also found these blue fibres, which were a match to the blue fibres that had been found on Ciara and Jane. And so they started all over again or added another layer of comparison for the scientists at the Chem Centre because they had these blue pants, which were of the time, of the era, and of the type that Mr. Edwards would have worn in 1996 and 1997. And so they did the same again, the same analyses again, and the slides, the side-by-side, slide-by-slides that we saw today, again, were visual reckoning of what the prosecution has been saying for all these months, that the fibres that were intertwined in these pants, that made up these pants, were the same colour, the same deluster, the same width. They just looked the same when we saw them today, as exactly the same as the blue fibres that were found on both Jane and Ciara, and critically also on the shorts of the Karakata victim, which is the physical link between that living victim and these two victims that were unfortunately found not living.
So could the witness shed any light on the total number of fibre matches?
Yeah, well, in total, Nat, the prosecution say there are 85 critical fibres, and they're both blue and grey and all the different types and makes of fibre across all 3 victims. And those 85 also make up the fibres, the blue fibres that were found in the car as well, that the prosecution say had been left there by Mr. Edwards and then found again almost 25 years later. So that is going to be the next 3 or 4 days, I'm afraid, because the prosecution will now turn. Mr. Powell will continue giving evidence for several days to come, and they will go through fibre by fibre and show where they were found, how they were found, their makeup, and we will again see these side-by-side comparisons that we got a taste of today during the PowerPoint that Mr. Powell went through, which was basically a historical recap of all the work that the Chem Centre has done. It was evidence, it is evidence, obviously, but the detailed evidence of every single fibre and how they compared, that's now what we've got to come to over the next 3 days or so.
Right, so Rhys Powell is likely to be on the stand for quite a while yet. Mm-hmm. And, we've chatted about, just how much detail is in this fibre evidence. And we've asked, as you mentioned, our forensic expert, Brendan Chapman, and we've asked the defence lawyers who come on the program about if they've ever seen this kind of detail. And often the answer has been no. And, of course, now we've learnt that that's because this was sort of world leaders. Ali, have you ever seen sort of anything in quite this sort of detail? Obviously, you've seen DNA evidence detailed before, but this is pretty extraordinary.
It is totally extraordinary. Never seen anything like this in detail. And being a television news reporter, you've got to remember I'm on a need-to-know basis. So for a 20, 30-second report on that night's news is not going to take in all this detail, as Tim's doing it very, very scholarly in a way. So a lot of that I'm just sort of paraphrasing. So, but I've never seen anything in such detail about. We just talk in overall figures, but it is incredible that the forensic stuff that we were, as I've said repeatedly before, we just kept thinking it was not happening. And all of a sudden, here they all are in every labs in Perth going through absolutely every little bit of fibre and DNA, and it is incredible after all this time of not hearing nothing to hear it coming out now.
Yeah, they were absolutely toiling away. Now, while most of us were enjoying the Easter break, Tim, you spent a couple of days revisiting some of the really important locations in the Claremont case.
Yeah, Nat, we've, the correspondence to the podcast has been so amazing and loyal and in depth and gives us things to think about. And some of the correspondence has been that, particularly some of our interstate and overseas listeners have listened devoutly, but have not had any visual keys to look at really, or to get an idea of what all these places that we've been talking about for so many months look like then and obviously look like now. So myself and Kate, our brilliant producer, we went out and we produced a couple of videos to give people an idea of the visual, the visceral locations that all these crimes happened, both in Claremont and then obviously where the spots where both Jane and Ciara their bodies were discovered. And I've written little pieces to go with that on the website. As you can imagine, it's still, Claremont hasn't changed that much physically. I mean, it's still a tiny geographical location. The Claremont, or the Continental as it was then, hasn't changed much really, the outside view anyway. And the areas where both Jane and Ciara were found, they have changed, but not so much that you don't really get an idea of the surrounds that those places that became crime scenes are. So so we've gone out there, we've done a little bit of a walkthrough, and so they'll be up on the website, the west.com.au website. if people wanted to have a look and get a look of the places that we've talked about for so long.
Yeah, and those links will also be available in the podcast description too, if you'd like to find them through that avenue. Because I think even for those of us who live in Western Australia and do know the area well, time has changed some of these locations a little bit, and it does help just to cement in your mind where we're talking about some of these things, particularly when you're talking about the phone box and, the bus stop where the Burger Boys were. So it is still quite interesting to see, and you must have sort of seen, some of those little changes.
Yeah, I mean, well, obviously, given there's 25 years nearly gone by, there are some physical changes, but I think what surprised me and Kate were that it hasn't changed that much, actually. That bus stop is still there, that Hungry Jack's is still there, Club Bay View or the building is still there, the hotel's still there, all those roads are still there. The phone box that Ciara made her call from isn't there, but that corner certainly is. And as you'll see in the videos, there are some physical reminders of where Jane and Ciara were found. So yeah, we just hoped that it would bring another level of understanding to those that have listened to us and engaged with us so brilliantly over the last few months.
That's right, definitely worth having a look at. Well, thank you both for your company today and your time today. Don't forget, if you would like to see those videos, as Tim mentioned, head to thewest.com.au. If you'd like to email us, we're at clermontpodcast@wanews.com.au, and we'll be back tomorrow for day 72 of Claremont in Conversation.
This podcast was produced by Kate Ryan and Alicia Preedy and recorded in the studios of 7 West Media. Audio files were provided from the archives of the 7 Network and the West Australian. Sign up for daily emails and all the latest on the Claremont trial at thewest.com.au.
For a fresh take on the news that matters, tune in to WA's newest morning show, The West Live, with Jenna Clark at thewest.com.au. The West Live not only delivers on what the day's big news stories mean for WA with hard-hitting interviews and analysis, but it will also make you smile with light-hearted chats and local gossip. The West Live, like talkback radio, but without the interruptions. Listen live weekdays from 8:45 a.m. on thewest.com.au or catch up with the podcast.